The sun hadn't fully risen over the Arizona desert when Officer Marcus Brennan pulled over the lone motorcycle on Route 89. He'd seen the rider from half a mile back, leather vest, silver bike, deliberate speed. A woman, alone, perfect. His dashboard camera conveniently malfunctioned 3 minutes before the stop, a technical glitch he'd perfected over 17 years on the force. What Brennan didn't know was that this woman had spent 12 years as a Marine Corps investigator, that her vest bore the insignia of the Iron Veil Riders, a brotherhood of veterans who'd sworn an oath longer than any badge, and that the small camera mounted on her helmet had been recording since Nevada. Her name was Captain Riley Cross, though she hadn't used her rank in 4 years. Not since the night she'd watched her unit burn in Kandahar, while commanders delayed the rescue for political optics. She'd left the military with scars no one could see, and a promise she'd made to her dying sergeant: never let another uniform go unchallenged when it forgets what it stands for. This morning, on a desert highway still cool from the night, that promise was about to cost her everything, or change a system that had rotted from the inside. Brennan approached with the swagger of someone who'd never been questioned. His hand rested on his weapon, his eyes scanned for witnesses. There were none, just empty road, Joshua trees, and the hum of morning insects. He didn't see the GoPro, didn't notice the emergency beacon blinking red on her bike's console, didn't realize that 140 miles away, in a warehouse converted into a command center, 19 former military riders were already watching the live feed and calculating arrival time. If you want to see how a single traffic stop exposed 17 years of corruption and united an entire community against a predator in uniform, don't go anywhere. This story will restore your faith in justice when the system fails. The motorcycle's engine cut to silence. Riley Cross kept both hands visible on the handlebars as Officer Brennan circled her bike like a predator assessing prey. His badge read 17 years of service. His eyes read something darker, the confidence of a man who'd learned that certain people don't get believed, certain roads don't have cameras, and certain moments disappear into paperwork that never gets filed. License and registration, Brennan said, his voice flat, professional, the kind of tone that sounds reasonable on bodycam footage, if the bodycam were working. Riley reached slowly into her vest pocket. Her movements were deliberate, trained, the muscle memory of someone who'd disarmed bombs and interviewed war criminals. She handed over the documents without speaking. Brennan studied the license. California plates. Long way from home, Ms. Cross. Visiting family in Flagstaff. Her voice was steady, neutral. No challenge, no fear, just facts. At 5:47 in the morning, he let the question hang, implying something without saying it. The oldest interrogation trick in the book. My sister works early shift at the hospital. I rode through the night to surprise her. Brennan's jaw tightened. Clean answer. No contradiction. He glanced at the iron veil patch on her vest, the skull with angel wings, and the words "Until Valhalla" stitched beneath, military symbolism. He'd learned to be careful with veterans. They knew their rights, sometimes filed complaints. But she was alone, and this road was empty. Step off the bike, please. Riley complied, moving with the same controlled precision. Her boots touched asphalt. The morning air smelled of creosote and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled. I'm going to need you to consent to a search of your vehicle. There it was. The request, designed to sound optional, but delivered with the implication that refusal meant guilt. Riley had seen this play 100 times in interrogation rooms overseas. The false choice, the manufactured pressure. Am I being detained, officer, or am I free to go? Brennan's expression shifted, just slightly, the micro-expression of someone whose script had been interrupted. I'm conducting an investigation. Investigation of what crime? Suspicious behavior, erratic driving. Riley's helmet camera captured every word. 140 miles away, in the Iron Veil Command Center, Former Staff Sergeant Marcus "Torch" Williams was already on the phone with a civil rights attorney. 17 other riders were checking fuel, strapping down gear, preparing to ride. "I was traveling 68 in a 65 zone," Riley said evenly. "That's within the margin of error for speedometers. You have no probable cause for a search, and I don't consent." Brennan stepped closer. Too close, invading space. Another intimidation tactic. "You seem nervous. Why would an innocent person refuse a simple search?" "Because the Fourth Amendment doesn't require me to prove innocence. It requires you to establish probable cause." The Hawk circled lower. Brennan's hand moved to his radio. "Dispatch, I'm going to need K9 backup at mile marker 247. Riley said nothing. She knew the play. The drug dog would alert on command, a skill corrupt handlers taught to justify searches. The dog would find nothing, but by then her bike would be disassembled on the roadside, her belongings scattered, her day destroyed. A punishment for asserting rights. But Brennan had made 3 critical mistakes. First, he'd assumed she was alone. In the command center, Torch had already dispatched the closest riders, 4 veterans on Highway 40, 20 minutes out. Second, he'd assumed this was her first encounter with institutional corruption. Riley had investigated 3 generals and 17 senior officers for war crimes. She'd testified before Congress twice. She knew how systems protected their own. Third, he'd assumed his dashboard camera malfunction was unique. It wasn't. Riley had spent the last 3 months riding this highway corridor, documenting 17 traffic stops where Brennan's camera coincidentally failed. She had names, dates, testimony from 3 women who'd been propositioned, 2 truckers who'd been robbed, and 1 teenager who'd been threatened into silence. "Officer Brennan," Riley said quietly, "do you know what a pattern of misconduct looks like to a federal investigator?" He froze. "Because I do. I spent 12 years building cases against people who thought their rank made them untouchable. I know how to document evidence, how to establish timelines, how to connect individual incidents into a prosecutable pattern." Brennan's hand moved toward his weapon. "Are you threatening an officer?" "I'm informing you that this interaction is being recorded on 3 separate devices, transmitted in real time to a secure server, and currently being monitored by 19 witnesses, including 2 attorneys and a former FBI agent." The Hawk landed on a Joshua tree 50 yards away. The desert held its breath. "And I'm informing you," Riley continued, her voice still calm, still steady, "that if you proceed with this unlawful search, if you manufacture probable cause, if you so much as touch your weapon without legal justification, I will personally ensure that every stop you've made in the last 5 years gets reviewed by Internal Affairs, the FBI, and the Department of Justice." Brennan's face had gone pale. His radio crackled, dispatch asking for his status. In the distance, the low rumble of motorcycle engines began to build. 4 bikes appeared on the horizon, riding in formation. Riley stepped back toward her motorcycle. "Am I free to go, officer?" For the first time in 17 years, Marcus Brennan realized he'd pulled over the wrong person. The 4 motorcycles pulled onto the shoulder with military precision, forming a protective semicircle around Riley's bike. Their engines idled with a synchronized rumble that vibrated through the desert floor. Each rider wore the same iron veil patch, each bike mounted the same recording equipment, each helmet displayed the same GoPro angle. They didn't dismount, didn't speak, just watched. Officer Brennan's hand trembled slightly on his radio. "Dispatch, I have multiple subjects at the scene. Are they interfering with the stop?" The dispatcher's voice crackled with routine bureaucratic distance. Torch, the lead rider, finally killed his engine. He was 6'4", his vest marked with ranger tabs and a purple heart pin. When he removed his helmet, his face showed the kind of weathering that came from 20 years of sun, sand, and decisions that cost lives. He didn't approach Brennan, didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the power dynamic. "Officer," Torch said, his voice carrying across the empty highway, We're just making sure our sister gets home safely. Constitutional right to observe public officials performing their duties. We'll stay right here." Brennan's jaw clenched. He knew the law, knew they were within their rights, knew his camera malfunction would look suspicious, with 4 working cameras now documenting his every move. The drug dog he'd called for was still 30 minutes out. 30 minutes of being watched, recorded, judged by veterans who understood chain of command and rules of engagement better than most officers ever would. "This is official police business," Brennan tried, but his voice had lost its authority. "You're creating an intimidating environment." "We're standing next to our motorcycles on a public road," Torch replied. "Same as thousands of bikers do every day. If you feel intimidated by citizens exercising their First Amendment rights, maybe you should call for backup." Riley hadn't moved. She stood beside her bike, hands visible, posture relaxed. This wasn't her first standoff. In Kandahar, she'd faced down Taliban commanders while negotiating prisoner exchanges. She'd stared at IEDs while calculating blast radius and civilian casualties. A corrupt cop on an empty highway didn't register on her threat assessment scale. Brennan's radio crackled again. "Officer Brennan, K9 unit is delayed. Mechanical issues." The Hawk took flight from its Joshua tree perch, wings catching the early morning light. Riley watched it climb, remembering her sergeant's last words. "The system protects its own until the cost gets too high. Make the cost too high." "Officer Brennan," Riley said, her tone shifting from neutral to something harder, something that carried the weight of 12 years investigating war crimes and institutional corruption. "I need to inform you that this stop is now part of an ongoing federal investigation into Section 1983 civil rights violations." Brennan's face went from pale to ashen. "Section 1983, deprivation of rights under color of law, federal jurisdiction, career-ending charges if proven." 3 months ago," Riley continued, "a woman named Sarah Martinez was pulled over on this exact stretch of highway. Your dashboard camera malfunctioned. You conducted an unauthorized search. You found her migrant worker card and told her that unless she provided certain favors, you'd call immigration." The 4 bikers' expressions didn't change, but their stillness somehow became more absolute. Torch's hands gripped his handlebars with the same controlled tension he'd used defusing bombs in Fallujah. "Sarah didn't report it," Riley said, "because she was terrified. But her husband is a Marine, and when he told his story at a VFW meeting, it reached people who knew how to investigate." Brennan's hand moved toward his weapon. Torch's engine roared to life. A warning, not a threat. The other 3 bikes followed suit, the desert filled with controlled thunder. "Don't!" Riley's voice cut through the noise. "The moment you draw that weapon without cause, this becomes attempted murder under color of authority. Every camera here records in 4K. Every file uploads to cloud storage in real time. You pull that gun, and you'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison." Where was this story going? What dark secrets would Riley uncover about Officer Brennan's 17-year career? Let me know in the comments if you've ever witnessed corruption being challenged, and what happened next. This is Highway 89, Arizona, Saturday morning, October 25th, 2025, and everything is about to change. Brennan's hand froze. The math was simple. Draw his weapon against an unarmed woman surrounded by witnesses and cameras, or back down and face investigation. Either way, his career was probably over. But one option kept him out of prison. His hands slowly moved away from his holster. Riley mounted her motorcycle. "You'll be hearing from the Department of Justice within 72 hours. I suggest you get a good attorney. And officer," she started her engine, "your dashboard camera has been malfunctioning on exactly 17 stops in the last 90 days. We have testimony from 9 victims. We have your shift schedules cross-referenced with complaint patterns. We have everything." The 5 motorcycles pulled onto Highway 89 in formation, leaving Officer Marcus Brennan standing alone in the dust, watching his entire world collapse in his rearview mirror. The Iron Vale Command Center occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Tucson, 40 miles from the Mexican border. Steel rafters, concrete floors, and walls covered with maps, photographs, and timelines that looked like something from a federal task force. Because essentially that's what it was, except funded by veterans pooling disability checks and operated by people who'd learned investigation techniques in war zones where the stakes were life and death. Riley's motorcycle was the fifth to arrive. The other four had peeled off at various points along Highway 89, returning to their routes, their patrols, their quiet observation of a corridor that had become a hunting ground for predators in uniform. Inside, Torch was already briefing the team. 19 people sat in folding chairs facing a projection screen showing Riley's helmet cam footage, synchronized with 3 other angles. Former military, all of them. Rangers, Marines, Navy intelligence, Air Force pararescue. They'd left service with honorable discharges and haunted eyes, finding purpose in a mission that didn't require orders from compromised commanders. That's 17 documented stops, Torch said, using a laser pointer to highlight patterns on a digital map. Same highway, same officer, camera malfunction in every single case. He clicked to the next slide, a spreadsheet of dates, times, victim demographics. 93% women traveling alone, 70% minorities, 100% during early morning hours when traffic is minimal. A woman in the front row raised her hand. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen, former Army psychiatrist, now running a practice specializing in trauma survivors. Do we have testimony from all 17 victims? 9 willing to go on record, Riley said, moving to stand beside the screen. 6, 2 afraid of retaliation. 2 we haven't been able to locate. They were migrant workers, probably moved on. She clicked to a series of photographs. But we have pattern evidence. We have GPS data showing Brennan's patrol car deliberately positioning itself on isolated stretches. We have radio logs showing multiple K9 call-outs that were later cancelled. And we have this, the screen filled with a financial document, bank statements highlighted in yellow. Officer Brennan makes $67,000 annually, Riley continued, but in the last 3 years he's deposited $340,000 in cash into various accounts. Small amounts, structured to avoid reporting requirements, classic money laundering pattern. The room went silent. This wasn't just harassment. This was organized crime. Torch spoke quietly. Where's the money coming from? Riley clicked to the next slide. That's where it gets complicated. Some of it matches dates when he pulled over truckers and conducted unauthorized searches. We think he was taking cash, drugs, maybe both. But the larger deposits, she paused, highlighting a series of $10,000 entries. Those match dates when young women reported suspicious encounters on Highway 89, women who were told their traffic violations would disappear if they cooperated. Someone in the back cursed softly. A former Navy SEAL named James Reaper Collins stood abruptly. We need to turn this over to the FBI now. We tried, Torch said. 3 months ago. Field office in Phoenix said they'd investigate. Nothing happened. We filed complaints with Internal Affairs. Also, nothing. The Sheriff's Department investigated themselves and found insufficient evidence. His voice dripped with bitter familiarity. Same story as always. The system protects its own. Riley had expected this. She'd seen it in the military, in federal agencies, in local police departments. The blue wall of silence. The institutional instinct to contain scandals rather than address them. The calculated decision that one officer's misconduct was less damaging than the publicity of admitting systemic failure. Which is why we're not going through normal channels, Riley said. She clicked to a new slide. A photograph of a severe-looking woman in her 50s, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Holloway. She spent 20 years prosecuting organized crime in New York before transferring to Phoenix. She doesn't care about local politics, doesn't owe favors to sheriffs, and has a reputation for building federal cases that can't be buried. How do we get to her? Dr. Chen asked. We already did. Riley smiled slightly. She's been watching our live feeds for the last 2 hours. She saw Brennan stop. She's reviewed our evidence files. And as of 45 minutes ago, she opened a formal civil rights investigation under DOJ authority. The room erupted in cautious relief. Not celebration, but the quiet satisfaction of people who'd spent months working in shadows, finally seeing their work acknowledged by someone with power to act. Torch held up his hand for silence. This isn't over. Federal investigations take time, months, maybe years. And Brennan isn't working alone. Riley's research shows coordination, other officers covering for him, dispatchers routing calls away from his stops, supervisors ignoring complaints. This is bigger than one corrupt cop. Riley nodded. Which is why we keep riding, keep documenting, keep protecting people on that highway until the system finally does its job. She looked around the room at 19 faces marked by combat, loss, and unshakable conviction. We made promises to our country, to each other, to the people who can't protect themselves. Today, we kept one of those promises. Tomorrow, we keep another. The meeting adjourned with the quiet efficiency of a military briefing. People moved to their motorcycles, checked their equipment, reviewed their patrol routes. They would return to Highway 89, to Route 40, to the dozen other roads where vulnerable people traveled and predators hunted. The Iron Veil riders had found their mission, and they would ride until justice, real justice, not the performance of it, finally arrived. Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Holloway's office overlooked downtown Phoenix, but she rarely noticed the view. She'd spent 20 years staring at evidence boards, not skylines. The walls of her office were covered with case timelines, witness statements, and photographs that documented 17 years of Officer Marcus Brennan's career. The helmet cam footage from Riley's stop played on loop on one monitor. On another, financial records scrolled past. On a third, a map showed Brennan's patrol patterns overlaid with reported crimes, complaints that went nowhere, and the suspicious gaps in official records. It's textbook predatory behavior, said Special Agent David Park, FBI Civil Rights Division. He'd flown in from the Los Angeles field office specifically for this case, an indication of how seriously the Bureau was taking it. He targets vulnerable populations, uses his authority as a weapon, and operates in jurisdictions where oversight is minimal. Holloway didn't respond immediately. She was reading testimony from Sarah Martinez, the migrant worker whose husband had spoken at the VFW meeting. The statement was brief, factual, devastating. Brennan had pulled her over for a broken taillight that wasn't broken. He'd searched her car without consent. He'd found her work permit and told her it looked fraudulent. A lie. Then came the proposition, charges disappear if she cooperated. Sarah had refused. Brennan had kept her on the roadside for 3 hours, called immigration enforcement, subjected her to humiliation she described in sparse, careful English that somehow made it worse. Finally, when a trucker stopped to ask if everything was okay, Brennan had let her go with a warning. The message was clear. Next time, there wouldn't be witnesses. How many others? Holloway asked quietly. Park consulted his tablet. The Iron Veil documentation shows 17 stops with similar patterns, but those are just the ones they managed to identify and investigate. Given that most victims of police misconduct don't report, either from fear or because they don't trust the system, we're probably looking at dozens more. Holloway stood, walked to the window, watched the city sprawl beneath her. Phoenix was growing, changing, becoming more diverse and complex. But in the shadows of that growth, in the spaces between cities where roads stretched empty and authority went unchecked, predators still hunted. What about the financial crimes? She asked. That's where this gets interesting. Park pulled up bank records on the main screen. Brennan has 5 accounts across 3 banks. The deposits are structured, never more than $9,000 at once, always in cash, always at different branches. Classic money laundering behavior. Sources? 3 categories. Park highlighted different sections of the timeline. First, civil asset forfeiture from traffic stops. He'd pull over truckers, claim he smelled drugs, conduct searches, seize cash under state law. Most victims never challenged it because hiring a lawyer costs more than the seized amount. Holloway's jaw tightened. Civil asset forfeiture, a legal framework designed to target criminal enterprises that had metastasized into a revenue stream for police departments. Property could be seized on suspicion alone, and the burden of proof fell on owners to prove their innocence. It was constitutional in name, tyrannical in practice. Second category, Park continued, is harder to document but follows a pattern. Brennan would pull over women, usually alone, usually traveling through rather than local residents, and conduct invasive searches. If he found anything remotely questionable, prescription medication without the bottle, large amounts of cash, even personal items he could claim looked suspicious, he'd offer a choice: arrest and vehicle impound, or resolve it here. Extortion. Sexual extortion in some cases, straight financial extortion in others. Depends on the victim and what leverage he could apply. Holloway returned to her desk, opened a file with the DOJ seal. And the third category? Park's expression darkened. That's the one that concerns me most. There are 7 deposits of exactly $10,000 each, made within 24 hours of drug busts on Highway 89. Not Brennan's busts. He wasn't the arresting officer. But he was present at the scene in each case, listed as backup or assisting officer. You think he's on someone's payroll? I think he's providing corridor security for a trafficking operation. The cartels pay police to look the other way, to delay responses, to ensure their shipments move safely through certain routes. 10 grand per load is standard rate in border regions. Holloway absorbed this silently. If Park was right, this wasn't just a case of one corrupt officer. This was organized crime, cartel involvement, and a compromised law enforcement infrastructure that went beyond Brennan. Other officers had to know, supervisors had to be complicit, the system had to be protecting him. What do we need for a prosecution? She asked. More victims willing to testify, financial experts to trace the money, wiretaps on Brennan's communications. And most critically, Park paused, we need to flip someone in his department, someone who knows the whole operation and will testify in exchange for immunity. If you're enjoying this story of corruption being exposed and justice finally arriving, hit that like button. What comes next will show you why one woman's courage inspired an entire community to stand up to a system that had failed them for 17 years. Holloway looked at the evidence board, at the faces of women who'd been victimized by a man sworn to protect them, at the gaps in official records where complaints had been erased or ignored. Then we start applying pressure, she said. We interview every officer who worked with Brennan. We audit every case he touched. We make it clear that the DOJ is watching, that silence is no longer safe, and that anyone who continues protecting him will go down with him. Park nodded. It's going to get ugly. It already is ugly. Now, we're just going to make it public. The federal investigation became public knowledge on a Tuesday morning when 3 black SUVs with Department of Justice plates pulled into the Coconino County Sheriff's Department parking lot. By noon, the news had spread through every law enforcement agency in northern Arizona. By evening, officers who'd worked with Brennan for 17 years were scrambling for attorneys. Deputy Thomas Garrett was the first to crack. He was 28. 5 years on the force, and had ridden backup for Brennan on 14 occasions. He'd seen things, not everything, but enough. Enough to know that when Brennan called for backup on Highway 89 late at night, it meant something irregular was happening. Enough to know that you didn't ask questions, didn't write detailed reports, and definitely didn't mention the cash that sometimes appeared in Brennan's patrol car. Special Agent Park interviewed Garrett in a windowless room at the Phoenix FBI field office. The young deputy sat with his hands folded, his lawyer beside him, his career hanging by threads he could feel fraying with each question. "Walk me through the night of March 15th, Park said, sliding a photograph across the table. It showed Brennan's patrol car pulled behind a sedan on Highway 89, timestamp reading 2:47 a.m. Garrett stared at the photo. "I received a backup call. Possible drug transport. Did Officer Brennan have probable cause for the stop? He said the vehicle was swerving. Was it?" Long silence. Garrett's lawyer leaned in, whispered something. Garrett shook his head slightly. "I didn't see it swerving. I arrived after the stop was initiated." Park pulled out another photograph. This one showed a young woman, maybe 25, sitting on the highway shoulder while Brennan searched her vehicle. "This is Rosa Delgado, college student. No criminal record. She was driving home from visiting her grandmother in Flagstaff. What did you observe during this stop?" "Standard search procedure." "Did she consent to the search?" I don't recall." Park's expression didn't change, but his tone sharpened. "Deputy Garrett, Ms. Delgado testified that she repeatedly refused consent. She said Officer Brennan told her that refusing meant she had something to hide, and that he'd call K9 and keep her there for hours. She had an exam the next morning. She was terrified, so she let him search." Garrett's hands tightened. This was the moment, the decision point. Protect Brennan and go down with him, or tell the truth and maybe salvage something from his career. "She didn't consent," Garrett said quietly. "Brennan searched anyway." "Did you stop him?" "No." "Did you report it?" "No." "Why not?" Garrett looked up, meeting Park's eyes for the first time. "Because everyone knew. Everyone in the department. Brennan had 17 years, commendations, connections. I had 5 years and student loans. You don't challenge someone like that. You just look the other way." His lawyer put a hand on his arm, but Garrett kept talking. The dam had broken. He'd call for backup on stops he knew were going to be problematic, stops where he needed a witness to testify that everything was by the book, even when it wasn't. We'd show up, watch him conduct illegal searches, watch him threaten people, and then we'd sign off on reports that made it all sound legitimate. Park slid a legal pad across the table. "I need names, every officer who provided backup, every supervisor who ignored complaints, every dispatcher who routed calls away from Brennan's stops." Garrett picked up the pen. His hand shook slightly. "If I do this, I need immunity. We can discuss immunity arrangements once we see what you're offering." "I'm offering 17 years of corruption. Brennan wasn't alone. There were at least 6 other officers doing similar things, targeting vulnerable people, taking cash. The supervisors knew. They had to know. But Brennan brought in money through asset forfeiture, kept crime stats low by not writing up certain people, and made the department look good in the media." Park leaned forward. "What about cartel connections?" Garrett's face went pale. "I don't know anything about that." "But you suspect something." Silence. "Deputy Garrett," Park said, his voice softer now, almost compassionate. "You're at a crossroads. You can protect a system that's already collapsing, or you can help us build a case that ensures this never happens again. You can be remembered as part of the problem or part of the solution." Garrett stared at the blank legal pad. In the hallway outside, other officers were being interviewed. The entire department was under federal scrutiny. Careers were ending. Pensions were at risk. The brotherhood of silence was fracturing under pressure it had never been designed to withstand. "There were calls," Garrett said finally. "Late at night. Brennan would take them in his car, away from everyone. Then he'd patrol certain stretches of highway at specific times. He'd wave certain vehicles through without stopping them, even when they fit profiles we'd normally pull over. I asked him about it once. He told me that some battles you don't fight because you can't win them." Park wrote rapidly. "Did he say who was calling?" "No, but there was a name he mentioned once. Javier. Said Javier took care of problems that the law couldn't solve." Park exchanged glances with Holloway, who'd been observing through the one-way glass and had just entered the room. They both knew that name. "Javier Moreno. A cartel lieutenant who'd been operating in Arizona for a decade, always one step ahead of federal prosecution. "Deputy Garrett," Holloway said, "you're going to need to tell us everything." The article appeared in the Arizona Republic on a Thursday morning, above the fold, impossible to ignore. Federal investigation exposes decades of police corruption on Highway 89. By noon, the story had gone national. CNN ran a segment. The New York Times followed with an investigation into civil asset forfeiture abuse. Social media erupted with stories from people who'd been victimized on that same highway stretch by that same officer and had never reported it because who reports police to police? Riley Cross watched the coverage from the Iron Vale Command Center, surrounded by the 19 veterans who'd spent months gathering evidence, documenting patterns, protecting travelers. They'd expected vindication. They'd expected justice. What they hadn't expected was the response from the community. It started with a phone call to the warehouse. A woman named Patricia Wu, a civil rights attorney based in Phoenix. "I'm organizing a town hall meeting," she said. "We need to discuss reform, oversight, accountability. The community needs to understand what happened and how we prevent it from happening again." The town hall was scheduled for the following Monday at Flagstaff High School Auditorium, capacity 800. By Friday, they'd received 2,000 RSVPs. By Sunday, they'd moved it to the Northern Arizona University Events Center, capacity 4,500. Monday evening, the parking lot was full 2 hours before start time. Riley stood backstage, watching the crowd through a gap in the curtains. Families, students, truckers who'd lost cash to illegal seizures, women who'd been harassed, migrant workers who'd been exploited, veterans wearing Iron Veil patches, local politicians sensing which way the wind was blowing, and reporters, dozens of reporters with cameras, notepads, and the scent of a story that would dominate news cycles for weeks. "You ready for this?" Torch asked, standing beside her. He'd been through firefights in 3 countries, but this was different. This was democracy in action, messy and loud and terrifying in its power. "No," Riley admitted, "but we're doing it anyway." The lights dimmed. Patricia Wu took the stage to thunderous applause. She was composed, professional, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 20 years fighting systems that ground people down. "Tonight, we talk about what happened on Highway 89, but more importantly, we talk about what happens next." As she introduced the panel, Riley Cross, Special Agent Park, a city council member, a sheriff from a neighboring county who'd been pushing for reform, and 3 victims who'd agreed to tell their stories publicly. The first was Sarah Martinez. She approached the microphone with visible nervousness, her husband standing in the front row for support. "My name is Sarah," she said in accented English. 3 years ago, Officer Brennan pulled me over and told me I was going to be deported unless I did what he wanted." The auditorium went silent. Sarah's voice shook, but she kept speaking. She described the fear, the humiliation, the feeling of absolute helplessness when the person supposed to protect you becomes the threat. When she finished, the applause was deafening. The second victim was a trucker named James Wilson. He'd lost $8,000 in cash to civil asset forfeiture, money he'd saved for his daughter's college tuition. "Brennan said it was drug money," Wilson said, his voice rough with anger that had been building for 2 years. "Searched my whole rig, found nothing, but kept the cash anyway. Said if I wanted it back, I'd have to hire a lawyer and prove it was legitimate. You know how much lawyers cost? More than $8,000. The third was a college student named Amy Chen, no relation to Dr. Sarah Chen from the Iron Veil team. She was 21, studying engineering at NAU. Brennan had pulled her over for a broken taillight, conducted an inappropriate search, made comments that crossed every line of professional conduct. "I didn't report it," Amy said, tears streaming down her face, "because I thought no one would believe me. Because he was a cop, and I was just a student. Because the system protects them, not us." Riley watched from the panel, her chest tight with familiar anger. This was why she'd left the military. This was the rot that had infected every institution, the belief that power granted immunity, that uniforms meant impunity, that ordinary people should just accept injustice because fighting it was too hard. "We're here," Riley said when her turn came to speak, "because 17 years is too long. 17 years of complaints ignored. 17 years of victims silenced. 17 years of a system that protected a predator instead of the community it was supposed to serve." She pulled up the evidence on the projection screen behind her. Maps, financial records, testimony, the undeniable pattern of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. "But we're also here," Riley continued, "because change is possible, because communities have power when they organize, because sunlight is the best disinfectant. Officer Marcus Brennan is currently suspended without pay, facing federal charges for civil rights violations, extortion, and conspiracy. 6 other officers are under investigation. 2 supervisors have been placed on administrative leave. And the Department of Justice has opened a comprehensive review of the entire Sheriff's Department. If this story has moved you, if you've ever felt powerless against institutional corruption, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. This is real justice happening in real time, and it's happening because ordinary people refuse to stay silent. The town hall lasted 4 hours. People lined up at microphones to tell their stories, to ask questions, to demand accountability. The energy in that auditorium was electric, furious, hopeful, the sound of a community that had been gaslit and ignored finally being heard. When it was over, Patricia Wu announced the formation of the Highway 89 Accountability Project, a citizen oversight group dedicated to monitoring police conduct and advocating for reform. Within 24 hours, they had 300 volunteers and $50,000 in donations. The system had failed. The people were building a new one. Officer Marcus Brennan sat in his attorney's office, watching his career disintegrate in real time on a laptop screen. The news coverage was relentless. Federal charges, civil lawsuits, internal affairs investigations. His pension was frozen. His house was under lien. His wife had filed for divorce and moved back to California with their 2 kids. 17 years of carefully constructed power, gone in 3 weeks. His attorney, a public defender named Robert Finch, who specialized in representing officers facing misconduct charges, scrolled through the evidence with the expression of someone calculating odds that weren't good. "They have you on 17 documented stops with camera malfunctions. They have financial records showing structured deposits. They have testimony from 9 victims. They have Deputy Garrett's cooperation, and he's giving them everything." Brennan stared out the window at downtown Phoenix. "Garrett's a coward. He knew what was happening. They all knew. Which is why the DOJ is offering you a deal," Finch said carefully. "You cooperate. You provide information about the larger operation. You testify about who else was involved, especially the cartel connections, and they'll recommend a reduced sentence." "How reduced?" 10 to 15 years instead of life." Brennan laughed bitterly. "Some deal. It's the only deal you're getting. The evidence is overwhelming. You go to trial, you'll lose, and then you'll die in federal prison." Finch closed the laptop. "The question isn't whether you're guilty. Everyone knows you're guilty. The question is whether you're going to help bring down the people above you, or whether you're going to protect a system that's already cut you loose." Brennan stood, paced to the window, looked down at the street where pedestrians moved through their lives with no idea that one of those lives had just imploded. He thought about the calls from Javier, the cash payments, the understanding that certain vehicles got waved through, certain shipments went unnoticed, certain roads remained safe for business. He'd told himself it was pragmatic. You can't stop the cartels, so why not profit from the inevitable? He told himself he was still doing good, protecting real citizens, keeping real criminals off the streets, just making a little extra on the side. He'd told himself a lot of things. None of them sounded convincing anymore. "What do they want to know?" Brennan asked quietly. Finch opened a folder. Names of officers involved in the corridor security operation. Names of supervisors who knew and looked the other way. Details about how the cartel payments were structured. And most importantly, everything you know about Javier Moreno's operations in Arizona. Brennan thought about Javier. The smooth voice on the phone. The cold certainty that problems could be solved. The implicit threat that disloyalty meant death. Testifying against him wasn't just career suicide. It was actual suicide. "They'll kill me," Brennan said, "which is why you'll be in witness protection. New identity, new location, federal marshals guarding you through the trial and after. So I spend 15 years in prison, get out, and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. That's the deal." Brennan returned to his chair, slumped into it. He thought about Riley Cross standing on that highway, her calm voice reciting his crimes, her helmet camera capturing everything. He thought about the Iron Veil riders who'd spent months hunting him like he'd hunted vulnerable people. He thought about Sarah Martinez's face when he'd threatened her, Amy Chen's tears, the trucker whose cash he'd stolen. For the first time in 17 years, Marcus Brennan felt something approximating shame. "Tell them I'll talk," he said. "But I want full protection, and I want assurances that my kids won't be targets." Finch nodded, pulled out his phone, made a call. 20 minutes later, Special Agent Park arrived with a digital recorder and a federal prosecutor. Brennan talked for 6 hours. He named 14 officers across 3 counties who were on cartel payroll. He described the payment structure, $10,000 per shipment that moved safely through the corridor. He detailed the supervision failures, the deliberate avoidance of oversight, the culture of silence that made corruption possible. He explained how civil asset forfeiture was weaponized not just for personal profit, but to fund the department without public scrutiny. And he gave them Javier Moreno, phone numbers, meeting locations, the names of businesses used as fronts, the distribution network that moved product from the border to Phoenix and beyond. By the time he finished, it was dark outside. Park turned off the recorder and leaned back. "You just destroyed a 17-year operation. A lot of people are going to be very unhappy with you." "I know. Good, because that means you were finally honest." Brennan was processed into federal custody that night. No media present, no cameras, just a quiet transfer to a secure facility where he'd await trial. His attorney filed the plea agreement the next morning, guilty to 5 federal charges in exchange for cooperation and a recommended sentence of 12 years. The news broke during the afternoon cycle. Social media erupted with opinions ranging from too lenient to justice served. The victims had mixed reactions. Some felt vindicated. Others felt that no amount of prison time could restore what had been taken from them. Riley Cross watched the coverage from the Iron Veil Command Center, surrounded by the team that had made it possible. They didn't celebrate. This wasn't victory. This was accountability. Overdue, incomplete, but real. "One down," Torch said quietly. 14 to go. The investigation was just beginning. Javier Moreno learned about Brennan's cooperation on a Wednesday afternoon while drinking coffee in a Tucson cafe that served as neutral territory for business discussions. The call came from his attorney, a legitimate one who specialized in criminal defense and asked no questions about where the retainer money came from. "He's talking," the attorney said. "Everything. Names, locations, financial structures." Javier set down his coffee carefully. His expression didn't change. In his world, displaying emotion was displaying weakness, and weakness got you killed. But inside, calculations were running at high speed. How much did Brennan know? Who else might be compromised? What operations needed to be shut down immediately? "What's the exposure?" Javier asked quietly. "Significant. He can connect you to at least 40 shipments. He has phone numbers, though probably burner phones. He knows meeting locations. He's describing the whole corridor security operation. Javier ended the call, paid for his coffee, and walked to his car, a nondescript Toyota that would never attract police attention. He drove carefully within speed limits to a storage facility on the outskirts of Tucson. Unit 217 contained no drugs, no weapons, nothing illegal. Just a satellite phone and a laptop with encrypted communications. He made 3 calls. The first was to his superiors in Sinaloa, informing them that a law enforcement asset had been compromised and operations needed to shift. The second was to his financial manager, instructing her to liquidate certain accounts and move funds to jurisdictions beyond U.S. reach. The third was to a man whose name Javier didn't know and whose services he'd used exactly twice before. A specialist who resolved problems that couldn't be resolved through legal channels. "I have a witness who needs to be silenced," Javier said. The specialist's voice was professional, clinical. "Federal custody?" "Yes. That's expensive and complicated." "How expensive?" 200,000, and it might not work. Federal witness protection is thorough. Javier considered this. 200,000 to potentially kill one witness versus the cost of shutting down an entire corridor operation and rebuilding elsewhere. The math wasn't favorable, but the message was important. People needed to know that cooperation had consequences. "Do it," Javier said, but the specialist never got the chance. Because while Javier was making his calls, Riley Cross and the Iron Veil Riders were conducting their own operation. They'd spent 3 weeks mapping cartel activities based on patterns they'd observed during their Highway 89 patrols. They'd identified suspicious vehicles, photographed license plates, documented delivery schedules. All information they'd passed to the FBI, but they'd also noticed something the FBI hadn't. A cafe in Tucson where certain people met regularly. A storage facility where a man matching Javier Moreno's description visited twice a week. Patterns of behavior that suggested coordination and planning. The Iron Veil didn't have legal authority to arrest anyone, but they had eyes and cameras and the ability to observe and document without being noticed. When Javier left the storage facility and drove to a house in a residential neighborhood south of Tucson, 4 motorcycles followed at a distance. When he met with 3 other men in the backyard, a meeting that lasted 15 minutes and involved a briefcase changing hands, those motorcycles were parked 3 blocks away with telephoto lenses recording everything. The footage was uploaded to the FBI within an hour. By evening, Special Agent Park had enough for a warrant. By midnight, federal agents were executing simultaneous raids on 6 locations connected to Moreno's operation. They recovered $2, $3 million in cash, 40 kilograms of methamphetamine, detailed financial records, and a laptop with encrypted files that would take weeks to break but would eventually reveal the entire distribution network. Javier Moreno was arrested at 2:47 a.m., exactly the time that Officer Brennan had pulled over Riley Cross 3 months earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Park called Riley at 3:15 a.m. "We got him, and we got the evidence to put him away for 20 years minimum." Riley, who'd been awake anyway, monitoring the operation from the command center, allowed herself a small smile. The specialist he hired? In custody, tried to enter the federal facility where Brennan's being held. We'd been monitoring communications, knew he was coming, so Brennan's safe, for now. The cartel has long memories, but we've disrupted their entire Arizona operation. 14 officers are under investigation. 7 have already been arrested. The corridor is effectively shut down. Riley looked around the command center at maps and timelines and photographs that documented months of work. Torch sat at a computer, updating files. Dr. Chen was reviewing trauma protocols for victims who'd need support through the trial process. Reaper was planning the next patrol route. "What happens now?" Riley asked. "Now we go to trial. Brennan testifies. Moreno testifies if he wants a deal. And we rebuild a system that actually serves the community instead of exploiting it. How long will that take? Years, maybe decades. But you started it. You and your Iron Veil team. You proved that ordinary citizens with cameras and courage can hold power accountable. Riley thought about her sergeant's last words in Kandahar, about promises kept, about justice earned rather than granted. "We're not done yet," she said. "There are other highways, other corridors, other places where power goes unchecked." "I know," Park said, "which is why the Bureau wants to hire you as a consultant. Teach other communities how to do what you did here." The offer hung in the digital silence. "I'll think about it," Riley said. But she already knew her answer. The federal courthouse in Phoenix was built to intimidate. Marble floors, high ceilings, the weight of institutional authority pressing down on everyone who entered. But on the morning of October 20th, when the trial of Marcus Brennan and 14 co-defendants began, the building felt different. It felt like accountability. The courtroom was packed. Victims sat in the gallery, some holding hands, some alone with their thoughts. Reporters filled every available seat, their cameras checked at security, but their notepads ready. Members of the Iron Veil Riders sat together, their presence a reminder that this trial existed because ordinary citizens had refused to accept injustice. Riley Cross sat in the front row, wearing the same leather vest she'd worn the morning Brennan pulled her over. The Iron Veil patch visible to everyone. A statement, Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Holloway delivered the opening argument with the precision of someone who'd been building toward this moment for months. "This is a case about betrayal," she said, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "Betrayal of trust, betrayal of duty, betrayal of the community these defendants swore to protect." She walked the jury through 17 years of corruption. The illegal stops, the stolen money, the sexual extortion, the cartel payments, the institutional silence that enabled it all. She presented evidence methodically, carefully, building a case so overwhelming that defense attorneys spent more time arguing for leniency than disputing facts. Brennan testified on the third day. He walked to the stand in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his career reduced to evidence in a federal prosecution. He spoke for 6 hours, describing the culture of corruption, naming names, explaining how the system had rotted from the inside. Some victims watched his testimony with satisfaction. Others couldn't bear to be in the same room and left. Amy Chen stayed, staring at him with an expression that mixed anger and something else. Recognition that even predators are human, broken in ways that don't excuse their actions, but explain the path that led them there. The defense attorneys tried to argue that Brennan was a scapegoat, that institutional pressures and inadequate oversight created the conditions for misconduct, that individual officers shouldn't bear sole responsibility for systemic failures. The arguments weren't entirely wrong, but they also weren't enough. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts for Brennan and 12 of the 14 co-defendants. 2 were acquitted on lesser charges, but convicted on the major ones. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Brennan received 12 years, as negotiated in his plea agreement. 6 other officers received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. 2 supervisors who'd ignored complaints and buried evidence received 8 years each, and Javier Moreno received 23 years without possibility of parole. The cartel lieutenant who'd corrupted an entire corridor sat motionless as the judge read the sentence, his face betraying nothing. But in the gallery, Sarah Martinez cried, not from relief, from the exhausting recognition that justice, when it finally arrived, couldn't restore what had been taken. Riley watched it all with the same steady calm she'd maintained since that morning on Highway 89. She'd seen justice before, in military tribunals, in federal courts, in the messy aftermath of accountability delayed but not denied. It never felt like victory. It felt like a debt partially repaid. After the sentencing, outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Riley gave a brief statement, her words chosen carefully. This verdict sends a message that no uniform grants immunity from the law. But the real work begins now. Rebuilding trust, reforming systems, and ensuring this never happens again. Patricia Wu stood beside her, announcing the Highway 89 Accountability Project's next initiatives. Civilian oversight boards, mandatory body cameras with independent review, revised civil asset forfeiture laws, and trauma support for victims of police misconduct. The press conference lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Riley walked to her motorcycle, parked beneath a mesquite tree that had somehow survived Phoenix's urban sprawl. Torch was waiting, along with Dr. Chen, Reaper, and 16 other Iron Veil members who'd made this possible. FBI offered me a consulting position, Riley said, strapping on her helmet, teaching communities how to document corruption and hold power accountable. You taking it? Torch asked. Riley looked at the courthouse, at the victims who were slowly emerging, at the reporters documenting a story that would ripple outward for months. She thought about her sergeant's promise, about the oath she'd taken when she joined the Marines, about the mission that had found her when she'd been riding through the desert trying to outrun ghosts. Eventually, she said. But first, I heard there's a sheriff in New Mexico who's been running a similar operation on Interstate 10. Targeting migrants, taking bribes, same pattern, different jurisdiction. Torch smiled slightly. So we ride? We ride. The 19 motorcycles pulled out in formation, engines rumbling like controlled thunder. They headed east, toward New Mexico, toward another highway where predators hunted and systems failed, and people needed someone to stand between them and injustice. Behind them, Phoenix continued its afternoon routine. Traffic, commerce, the ordinary pulse of a city where extraordinary things had just happened. The courthouse stood in afternoon sunlight, its marble facades reflecting nothing of the drama that had unfolded inside. But in City Hall, police departments, sheriff's offices across Arizona, administrators were quietly reviewing policies, looking for vulnerabilities, wondering if their own departments could withstand the scrutiny that had dismantled Brennan's career. The message had been received. Cameras were everywhere. Citizens were organized, and silence was no longer protection. 3 months later, the Arizona State Legislature passed the Highway Accountability Act, requiring all law enforcement vehicles to have functioning cameras with independent cloud backup, prohibiting officers from conducting stops alone on isolated roads, and establishing civilian review boards with subpoena power. It wasn't perfect. Reforms never are. But it was progress, built on the foundation of one woman's refusal to accept that power meant impunity. Riley Cross never returned to Highway 89, not because she was afraid, but because the corridor didn't need her anymore. The Highway 89 Accountability Project had 400 volunteers conducting regular patrols, documenting stops, providing support to travelers. The predators had moved on, or been arrested. The system, imperfect and fragile, was slowly learning to serve rather than exploit. She rode instead to places where the work hadn't been done, where corruption still thrived in shadows, where promises needed to be kept. In a storage unit in Tucson, the Iron Veil Command Center remained operational. Maps covered the walls, not just Arizona now, but New Mexico, Texas, Nevada. Red pins marked locations where complaints clustered, where patterns suggested institutional rot, where citizens needed someone to document the truth. Torch managed operations. Dr. Chen provided trauma support. Reaper coordinated with legal teams. And across the Southwest, veterans who'd sworn oaths to protect the Constitution found new purpose in holding those institutions accountable when they forgot what they were supposed to defend. The work was slow, unglamorous, often discouraging, but it mattered. Because justice delayed isn't justice denied if someone refuses to stop demanding it. Because systems only change when the cost of remaining broken becomes too high. Because promises made to dying sergeants in burning vehicles halfway across the world still mean something when carried home and put into practice on desert highways where the vulnerable travel and the powerful prey. Riley Cross rode into the New Mexico sunset, 19 motorcycles behind her, cameras recording, evidence accumulating. Another corrupt system about to learn that silence ends when someone decides to speak. The highway stretched ahead, endless and uncertain. But she'd made a promise, and Iron Veil riders kept their promises, always. Thank you for watching this story about courage, accountability, and the power of ordinary people to challenge extraordinary corruption. If this moved you, if you believe in justice that doesn't stop when it gets difficult, subscribe to this channel. We have more stories like this, stories about promises kept, systems changed, and the quiet heroes who refuse to accept that wrong is inevitable. Hit that notification bell and we'll see you in the next one. Until then, ride safe, stand strong, and never stop demanding that power serve the people, not the other way around.